Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Brennan Center at the NYU School of Law. I'm your moderator from this evening. My name is Adam Serwer. I'm a journalist at The Atlantic. I'm a staff writer in the Ideas section. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform and revitalize when necessary, defend the systems of democracy and justice. You can keep up with their work online at brennancenter.org, or you can follow them on Facebook or on Twitter. And you can listen to their podcasts on their website or wherever you get your podcasts. That's always tough. All the podcast apps are terrible. But you should still listen to the Brennan Center podcast. Sorry, one second. So tonight we're hosting one of the Brennan Center's own, Mike German, who is a fellow with the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, where he focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. He used to work at the ACLU as the Policy Council for National Security and Privacy, and before that, he served 16 years as an FBI special agent specializing in domestic terrorism and covert operations. And today we're discussing his book, Thinking Like a Terrorist. We're discussing his second book. His first book is Thinking Like a Terrorist, which you should also read. But we're discussing his new book today, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Our Democracy. In the book, Mike outlines how the FBI since 9/11 has transformed itself from being famous for prosecuting organized crime and corruption to becoming a secretive domestic intelligence agency. Please welcome Mike German. So I think we're going to start with a question which some people here may know the answer to, but which I think everybody is probably curious about, which is, why did you go from being an FBI agent to being a staff attorney at the ACLU?
That's just what everyone does at the FBI. And to be clear, I wasn't an attorney. I was a counsel.
Oh, you were a
policy counsel that worked on the policy in the legislative office. I actually had a friend from college who knew me when I was in college, and all I talked about was wanting to join the FBI and be an FBI agent. And we met up after I had started working at the ACLU, and he said, I never could have pictured you working at the ACLU. And I said, yeah, but I never could have pictured that the U.S. government would have a torture policy. Right? That I don't think I changed that much. I think that the government changed around me. So, I just saw that a lot of the changes that were happening within the FBI and within the Justice Department were putting at risk the things that I had joined the FBI to protect. And the ACLU was doing great work then to address that. So that seemed like a great place for me to go, and luckily they let me come.
So speaking to that, can you tell us a little bit about the political climate when you joined the FBI and then how it was different when you left?
Sure. So I joined the FBI straight out of law school in 1988, and it was when there was a big hiring phase. The FBI is a really small agency, only 12,000 FBI agents around the country and around the world now. So growing up wanting to be an FBI agent, the issue was always, are they going to be hiring? And there was this period of time where savings and loans had been deregulated, so the people who owned savings and loans were investing in all kinds of crazy get-rich-quick schemes, and the bottom fell out of it. And back then, the Justice Department used to prosecute people who treated publicly insured money that way. And so there was a huge hiring to work on savings and loan fraud, and that's how I got hired straight out of law school.
I think you hinted at this, but you referred to the FBI as a small agency, which I think may come as a little bit of a surprise to the audience. But in fact, you mentioned this in your book, that the FBI is actually smaller than the NYPD.
That's correct, yeah.
Whereas obviously the NYPD serves a city of millions of people, but the FBI is responsible for a country of 300 million.
Right. And again, only 12,000 of the 30,000 employees are actually agents, and they're spread over, I think now there's something like 60-something field offices and dozens of legal attaché offices abroad. So for the impact they have on our society, it's really incredibly small.
Your book goes back to the origins of the FBI and what it was originally meant to do. Can you talk a little bit about that original mission, and is it in your view, has the FBI strayed from it, and was it necessary, if so, for it to do so?
So the FBI was created through executive fiat. The Attorney General at the time, Charles Bonaparte, wanted the Justice Department to have its own investigators to help work cases, and went to Congress seeking the authority to hire these investigators. And Congress said no. There was a lot of expression that they were afraid of having a federal police agency that would spy on average citizens. And so they rejected this proposal. So when Congress adjourned, President Roosevelt gave the Attorney General the authority to just hire the agents. And by the time Congress came back, the agents were already hired, and there was a prominent story in the newspaper based on leaked documents about congressional corruption. And President Roosevelt said, you know, is it just that they're trying to protect themselves, and changed the political climate in quite a drastic way. So with the Attorney General's promise that he would keep this agency in check, they went ahead and let it go forward.
An early lesson on how well the FBI manipulates Washington politics.
Right.
So you write that a misunderstanding of the relationship between, quote, radicalization and violence has distorted the FBI's approach to its mission. And could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So when Teddy Roosevelt started the FBI, his argument was that this was an agency that would hold the most powerful to account, the most powerful business people who were committing frauds against the public, corrupt officials. But very quickly after that, in the approach to World War I, the government wanted the FBI to be involved in more espionage-like activities in countering the threat from German provocateurs and German spies. And that grant of authority opened the door to spying on people's political beliefs. And they were no longer concerned with who was actually doing harm, but who was thinking the wrong thoughts. And the centers of those thoughts tended to be around universities, journalists, people who are in the business of spreading ideas, rather than people who are committing crime. And they labeled these people radicals because they were all seeking some kind of radical change to the establishment, whether it was the financial establishment or the government establishment. And that concept of targeting radicals for suppressive work, because when they're not committing crimes, you have to have other means to go after them, was something that I think really appealed to a young J. Edgar Hoover, who ultimately became the director of the Radicals Division of the FBI and ultimately director of the FBI itself. And that concept of radicalization, that it's not the people who are engaging in violence that are the problem, but the people who are spreading ideas that might lead to violence are the problem, is what this radicalization concept was. And after the Palmer raids, there was a public outrage about the abuse of these law enforcement authorities. So there was a reestablishing the FBI as a law enforcement agency. Harlan Fiske Stone, the Attorney General, came in and said, no, you know, we're going to have a law enforcement mission for this organization that will prevent that kind of political spying. And it only lasted until the run-up to World War II, when again, fear of national security threats led to an expansion of the FBI's mandate. And they again revived this radicalization concept mostly after the war, when Hoover again saw communists as the big problem. And there weren't a lot of communists, and they weren't doing a lot. So he wanted to expand it to include socialists, because sometimes socialists say things that sound like what communists say. And then and that expanded then to the anti-war left, that they were saying things that sounded like what the socialists said, so we might as well have a program to examine them. And all, again, from this concept of radicalization, that it's the spread of ideas that's the problem rather than the spread of violence.
Can you talk a little bit about how that approach to radicalization has reproduced itself in the modern day? Because all of that, I'm sure, sounds very familiar to the audience.
So it was interesting, because when I started working undercover in terrorist groups, I was basically, the advice I was given was to wear jeans and a T-shirt and not my suit and tie. So I was desperate for some kind of information about how to work with these groups and what they were trying to accomplish, and looked to academic works on the topic. And there were basically two schools of terrorism research. One that argued that terrorism was the product of a diseased mind, that it was some sort of mental defect. And a lot of mostly psychologists and psychiatrists did studies trying to find this mental defect that could be useful both in finding a cure for it, if we could find the defect, but also in identifying people with the defect before they had become a terrorist and isolating them from the community. And then the other school was mostly political scientists, and they argued that terrorism is just a label that we put on certain kinds of political violence. But you can't understand that segment of political violence without understanding all of the political violence in that situation and understanding it in context to the conflict, so that it was silly to try to study terrorism in and of itself. And by the 90s, when I was working undercover, there had been enough psychological studies that they realized there was no defect, that these were rational people engaged in horrific activity, to be sure, but doing it with a rational basis. And so after 9/11, they couldn't bring up the mental defect story, so radicalization proved elusive, the cure for that, because it imagines a mental defect, but it's outside of the scope of psychosocial science. So there's no diagnosis available. We can just know it when we see it. And typically, when you look at the radicalization models that the government uses, they identify First Amendment protected activities, beliefs, associations, and political activity are all indicators of increasing dangerousness down the radicalization pathway. So it's a way that the way the government put it is they couldn't wait until somebody actually was blowing something up. They had to move left of boom. And the radicalization model provided a blueprint for who is left of boom. So if you are according to the FBI's radicalization document, radicalization from conversion to jihad, it suggested that converting to Islam was the first step on this pathway. And then adopting Muslim dress or other customs, going to mosque, joining a Muslim social group, or getting involved in political activity with other Muslim groups were all indicators of increasing dangerousness. So it wasn't then surprising that we saw so much surveillance of Muslim communities for no particular reason other than that they were Muslim American communities.
I hope nobody here is engaged in any political activity.
Right.
Because that's...
And you're already in a university, which is one of the nodes of radicalization, so 2 strikes.
So you write that the FBI appears to be immune to traditional efforts at oversight. Could you explain what you mean by that?
I think the FBI poses a difficult problem for overseers because it is an essential agency in many ways. There are real criminals out there who would prey upon those that they could, and we need a force that is effectively tooled to address that problem. We need an agency that can work political corruption, because that's something that harms our confidence in government. So we have to give this agency those kinds of tools that can so easily be abused. And because those tools can be targeted against the overseers themselves, it's sometimes risky for them to push too hard against the FBI. And they also want to make sure the FBI is effective in whatever jurisdiction they come from in protecting the community from different crime elements. So it's a little, I think, difficult as a problem without this history of abuse. And when a problem arises like 9/11, it's much easier to just give them more authority and more room to do work secretly, rather than say, no, obviously 9/11 was an example of how dysfunctional this agency had been. we should use this as an opportunity to rip the lid off of this organization and see what's really wrong with it. So it does present a problem in the best case scenario, but we also have seen significantly that FBI officials are willing to tell Congress things that sound nice but aren't necessarily true, particularly about how it's using its own authorities. And when the secretive agency can mislead its overseers, it's very hard for the overseers to understand what's real, whether some abuse. A perfect example, there was one of the first things I worked on at the ACLU, there was a Freedom of Information Act requests and Privacy Act requests by a number of political organizations that felt in the aftermath of 9/11 they were being spied on by the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. So the ACLU helped them do a nationwide Privacy Act request for information, and it turned out, sure enough, the FBI was engaged in a lot of spying, including against a group in Pennsylvania called the Merton Center for Peace and Justice. And when that came out that this agency that was well respected in the community was being spied on, Congress wanted to know more. And what the FBI told Congress was, well, this was all part of a different investigation. There was some Muslim terrorist who just happened to be attending this anti-war rally, and the surveillance was based on this other investigation. We weren't actually spying on the Merton Center. And that turned out to be entirely false. So that makes it very difficult because in addition to the expansive powers, we've also given them a much thicker cloak of secrecy. And when there is that kind of secrecy, it's easy to manipulate what facts come out to the public's attention and what doesn't. And I think that makes it very hard for members of Congress who have an interest in reform from generating the kind of public support that's necessary to make that happen, because they can't make the story understandable to the public because so much of it is secret.
You described the FBI in your book as a, quote, lawless agency, which I think obviously may come as a surprise to people, given that you're a former agent. What precisely do you mean by lawless?
So I use that because it technically is lawless. When it was created in 1908, it didn't have a charter. Congress didn't say, this is what the agency should do and this is how it should do it. So it had always been operating just through executive fiat. The president told the FBI what to do, and it did that. So the limitations on the FBI didn't exist, and they didn't exist until after J. Edgar Hoover died, when the Church Committee, which I have the pleasure of working with Fritz Schwartz, who was chief counsel to the Church Committee, did an incredible, really the only comprehensive examination of our intelligence agencies, and found widespread abuse. The effort was for Congress to write a legislative charter that would limit the FBI's investigative powers, but instead the Attorney General, Edward Levy, stepped forward and said, I'll issue guidelines. And those guidelines, just like the Harlan Fiske Stone reforms, were intended to focus the FBI where there was a reasonable indication of illegal activity. So again, restore it to its function as a law enforcement agency. But because they're Attorney General guidelines, every Attorney General can modify them, and most do. And incrementally, they've moved somewhat stronger, somewhat less, until 2001. And after 9/11, Attorney General John Ashcroft significantly loosened the guidelines. And then again in 2008, under Attorney General Michael Mukasey, they were extensively rewritten to the point where now, under the FBI's guidelines, the FBI can conduct an investigation of you called an assessment with no factual basis to believe anyone has committed a crime. And these investigations can be very intrusive. It can involve not just physical surveillance, subpoenas for your telephone records, subscriber information, and other account subscriber information, the recruitment and tasking of informants, so they can recruit somebody to infiltrate your group to find information, again, without any basis to believe anybody has done anything wrong. So that's what I mean by lawless. They're not bound by the law.
FBI leadership has frequently invoked the benefits of diversity, but the Bureau seems to actually, I mean, if you look at statistics, they seem to actually be struggling more with recruiting, with diversifying their staff than they have in the past. Why is that?
So when I joined the FBI in 1988, it was almost 20 years after J. Edgar Hoover had died, and every director was trying to, or at least spoke to, the need to diversify the agency. And every year, it was getting better. It still never approached looking like the rest of America, but you could see improvement. That improvement was not it was not easy. When I was a young agent, there was a class action suit by women agents, there was a class action suit by Latino agents, and there was a separate class action suit by black agents. So there were problems, discrimination problems that continued to exist inside the agency, but you could see that there was some progress being made, and I believe the lawsuits were forcing even more progress to be made. But after 9/11, we saw a retrenchment, and I personally believe that that's because of the shift to a national security focus. That when you're away from law enforcement and you're no longer looking at people you can prove are breaking the law, and instead looking at people who might be national security threats, it's very easy, it's just part of human nature to see people who have a different life experience from you as being more dangerous, more of a risk. And so when you have an agency that's still overwhelmingly white, it's easy for the normal security protocols that are applied to an applicant to look more critically at somebody who doesn't look like the rest of the FBI. And particularly, I go through a number of case studies in the book of agents who came under suspicion because of their religion, were Muslim agents, or because of their national origin, because their family was from or they were born in a particular foreign country, and that when there are small problems, those are magnified because there's already this suspicion, and it's a lot easier. The disrupt in the book is based, and the title is based on the concept that the FBI pulled from the Hoover era, COINTELPRO era, called the disruption strategy, where they feel that even if you can't prove somebody is committing a crime, you have the authority to disrupt their activities. And even though the FBI can't prove somebody inside the FBI is a spy, well, the easiest way to disrupt them is to get them out of the FBI, and that way, if they're a spy, we just saved ourselves, and if they aren't, oh, tough luck.
I think you got into that a little bit just now, but I mean, how does the Bureau's lack of diversity affect the way that it approaches its mission?
Well, I think for any law enforcement agency to not be representative of the communities it polices, that creates a problem, and a knowledge gap. I mean, part of it is that it's easy to look at suspiciously at somebody who might be engaging in very normal behavior for that community, and when the FBI has the powerful tools that it has, it can do real damages before it determines this was all much ado about nothing. So having a diverse workforce, I think, is essential to the effective management of a law enforcement agency. But more so where what we've seen, and some of the case studies I talk about in the book, involve activities that maybe start out with a justifiable purpose, but then go on long beyond when it's appropriate, or expand to so many people that it should be obvious on its face this is an abusive investigation. And it really takes somebody in the agency, number one, having robust guidelines so they can point to a rule that says you can't do this, but second, having the courage to stand up and say, you know, I know this community, I know what's going on here, I know what you're doing, you need to stop this. And I talk about a number of courageous agents who make that stand, and unfortunately to the detriment of their own careers.
You say something in the book that I think is really interesting and I think relevant, particularly relevant to the case that you're making, but can you describe how the quote-unquote loopholes in Bureau rules against racial and religious profiling quote, swallow the rules themselves?
Sure. So, because of a lot of good work that many civil rights groups were doing in the 1990s, there was a lot of research about racial profiling showing that it was an ineffective technique, that even if you put aside the discrimination involved and the negative impact it was having on the communities that were targeted, it was simply ineffective law enforcement. It was a bad way of going about the job, and they did a good job of educating law enforcement about that. And I was proud to be in the FBI when we were part of the vanguard of that law enforcement instruction. But it became clear that we needed to have strong federal guidelines. So Attorney General John Ashcroft and President Bush said that they were interested in putting this together, and eventually did, except that 9/11 intervened. So there was a big cutout for national security and border integrity cases. So basically, the message that was being sent to law enforcement is, this is a bad technique, it doesn't work, it alienates communities, but we, the federal government, are going to keep it for our most important investigations. And so what law enforcement learned from that, wink, wink, okay, I hear what you're saying, that's all political correctness. What you're really telling us is that it's very effective because you use it in your most important investigations. So I felt it was the loophole that swallowed the rule. And then in 2014, they were modified again, and in the meantime, the FBI, because it had this wide loophole, had actually implemented a racial and ethnic mapping program across the United States. So the FBI was using census data to map all American communities by race and ethnicity and track what they called ethnic behaviors. At the ACLU, we tried to use FOIA to get what these ethnic behaviors were, and unfortunately the courts wouldn't let us have them. And ethnic facilities. I'm not really sure exactly what that is either, but very clear, obvious racial profiling. The FBI wasn't drawing these maps because they like pretty pictures. They were drawing the maps because they were going to treat people on one side of a line differently from people on the other side of that line. And in 2014, when the Obama administration modified the Ashcroft racial profiling guidelines, they actually authorized this racial and ethnic mapping program. So again, it's sending the exact wrong message to law enforcement about the use of racial profiling.
I think ethnic activities is really going to stick with me for a while. You write that there are systemic problems at the FBI that, left unchecked, make the Bureau a threat to the very democracy it is intended to serve. That's a heavy statement. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Sure. I think first and foremost, we have to have confidence that there is a rule of law that applies to everyone equally to feel secure in our society. And when we see that the law is not applied equally, and we see that in many, again, I joined during the savings and loan crisis where the people responsible for this financial crisis were being held to account. And to see the 2008 financial crisis where very few were held to account, it creates a cynicism in society. When you see the FBI brazenly targeting certain groups, not just Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11, but labeling eco-terrorism as the #1 domestic terrorist threat, even though there's not a single homicide related to environmental activism, it became clear that your political opinion would put you at risk. And so that kind of behavior undermined the rule of law and undermined that confidence, while at the same time, as we talked about, the FBI not being completely honest with Congress, so that branch of government can't operate as effectively as it needs to, and also with the courts, because the FBI was engaging now in intelligence activities that they claimed needed this extra layer of security. They developed what was called parallel construction. So parallel construction is when you use some secret intelligence technique to gather information, and then once you find what you need, you go back and you use legitimate legal tools to collect that very same information you already have, and then present it to the courts as if that was the original way you collected the information. so that the defendant and the judge and the jury would never know that it was actually this other tactic, and so you'd never have the opportunity to challenge the constitutionality of that tactic.
Does America need a new church commission?
Critically, and it's overdue, actually. And it's not just to look at the abuses, because the abuses, people tend to put security and privacy on a balance, that somehow giving up your privacy makes the country more secure. But if you're not a criminal or a terrorist or a spy, the government invading your privacy does nothing to increase security, right? That's just abusive, and it then creates a problem for the government because now they have all this information they don't know what to do with. So that way of looking at it is wrong, and our security is just as vulnerable to a mismanaged FBI as our liberty is. And we have to understand that, and it's become so apparent now where we have $70 billion we give to the intelligence agencies every year to protect us from foreign threats, and somehow the Russian government came in and meddled with our election of the highest office in the land. And whether you believe that influenced the outcome or didn't influence the outcome, it certainly has disrupted our government in a very profound way and has severely undermined public confidence in our government and in the agencies that are supposed to protect the rule of law. So how could an agency, given so many resources, given the authority to spy on all of us as aggressively as it can, isn't able to find the obvious threat that came? And before that, the financial crisis. In 2004, the FBI's white-collar crime division head started warning about mortgage fraud, and he said, this is going to be an enormous problem that's going to risk our economic viability if we don't address it, and asked for more resources. And Congress and the FBI leadership said, no, we're focused on counterterrorism. That's the #1 threat, not realizing that a financial collapse was a national security threat, arguably far greater than anything any terrorist could inflict on us.
So I want to pivot a little bit into the politicization of the Bureau, which I think is another important part of your book. The Daily Mail published something of a pro-Trump slant on your criticisms of James Comey and Robert Mueller, but can you articulate your criticisms of their stewardship of the Bureau and how they made the systemic problems you describe in the book worse?
So I start the book talking a lot about the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and you might remember Colleen Rowley, who was a colleague of mine at the FBI, an agent in Minneapolis, who ultimately wrote a letter that was made public that laid out a lot of the evidence that, it's hard to go back in time and remember how all that's happened, but the Bush administration was resisting the idea of an independent commission to study the intelligence failure, and information was not coming out, and what we were being presented with from the intelligence community was this was such a diabolical attack. These people attacked without warning. Somehow these operatives were in the United States and able to do all this without associating with any target of the federal government that we knew of, and this shows how diabolical we are, and therefore we need these grander tools, when in fact, everyone in the FBI, especially in Minneapolis, because that's where one of the cases was based, knew that there were cases that the FBI had that were giving some clue that there was something afoot. And it wasn't a very clear picture, but it was certainly clear that it was an information management problem, not an information collection problem. But of course, doing information management reform would require a much more thorough house cleaning of the FBI, where if they could maintain it was just a lack of information, the solution's easy. Give us more authority, give us more resources. So that Robert Mueller went along with that, even though he clearly knew what the real problems were, I find very problematic, and particularly when things started going further off the rails, where some of the activities went even beyond the broad mandate Congress gave them with the Patriot Act, and they were actually violating the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act by doing warrantless surveillance of Americans without going through the FISA court, which was illegal. That was actually a crime, and the FBI knew about that but didn't investigate it. Similarly, with the military and CIA detainee abuse and torture programs, there were agents around the world reporting this back to headquarters that, hey, this is a crime that's happening in front of me. I'm going to get my handcuffs out and arrest these CIA agents. Tell me what to do. And they were told, just withdraw yourselves. And for some reason, the FBI got praised for that when if I had been at a bank robbery and said, hey, these guys are robbing a bank, and the answer was don't participate, I would have felt a little odd. And so I have concerns that Mueller's leadership of the FBI, particularly when people like me and Colleen Rowley raised concerns and were silenced, that the reputation he has is not necessarily well-deserved. And likewise, with Comey's shorter tenure at the FBI, but obviously is marred by some very strange and problematic decisions, both in how he handled. I mean, just the fact that the FBI is investigating both candidates in a presidential campaign should raise some concerns for a democracy, that this agency has the power to withhold or release information that can undermine one campaign or the other, and that's clearly what James Comey did. And then his behavior after Trump was elected, I think, was even harder to understand, and I don't think fits the model that either it's a deep state or that he was somehow trying to undermine Trump. I think it just reflects really bad decision-making at the top and an inability of high-ranking members under the director to tell the director not to do something the director wants to do.
So this is a question from the audience. Do you have any thoughts on the FBI's handling of the evidence in the Kavanaugh case when they were sort of asked to investigate the allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, but the news came out later that the White House had fairly circumscribed the investigation?
That's highly problematic and undermines the very purpose. I mean, the FBI could have easily said, we either are going to do an investigation, in which case we follow all leads and to their logical conclusion, or not do an investigation and let that political process take its course. But deciding to do a partial investigation, I don't think was ever going to provide any kind of reasonable answer, either exonerating the nominee or finding some reason to hold him accountable. You have to do a full investigation. There's no such thing as a partial investigation.
This is another question from an audience member. Is the 2020 election already compromised, and is there anything we can do? And I think we means Americans writ large. Tell me if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the government has not reacted in a sane way to the fact that foreign governments can so easily manipulate our elections. Again, whether you believe that actually had an impact on the election or not, it certainly had an impact on the way we govern, and that has not been a priority for either party, it seems. That's hugely problematic. And again, I think that's what's happened over the last, since 9/11, the last 18, 19 years, is that we have lost a lot of public faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect those things. So even if the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security were doing everything exactly as they should, how would we know that, right? And who would have confidence that that's actually true when we know they've told us false stories so many times before and engaged in other problematic and abusive behaviors? So that undermining of the public faith, I think, is just as dangerous as if the foreign governments are actually successful in doing this.
So another question from the audience. The president and administration have been working hard to undermine the credibility of the FBI. Are they succeeding, and does it matter?
And I guess it's because I come from the FBI that I tend to hold those people more responsible than others. I mean, I think you can't expect politicians to do anything but act like politicians and take advantage of facts to pursue the policies and win the offices that they want to win. I mean, similarly, I think the media sensationalizes a lot of things, and you can't really stop that. You know, I think a lot of the public fear of terrorism was because we had a media that amplified the threat far beyond any objective view of it. But there has to be some base truth for us to have a society where we can all work together to solve common problems. And you know, if the intelligence community does anything, it should be providing that base truth and assuaging public concerns about threats that aren't existential and focusing on what's actually real for us to deal with. And that they are not doing that has already politicized the situation. So once the FBI is politicized, then I don't think it can complain that it's being a political whipping boy either. You know, I think that's a problem that is going to be very difficult to get out of absent some kind of church committee oversight, where you have the lid lifted off and everybody can look and determine for themselves both what went wrong and what is needed to correct it.
So a slight reframing of this question from the audience. Do you think racism within the FBI has affected how they've handled the threat of white supremacy?
I think that's part of it. I think a lot of it is white supremacy isn't this extreme ideology at the fringe of our society. It's foundational to the creation of our government. You know, and that was one of the interesting things I learned going and hanging out with neo-Nazis is how fundamental it is and how recent it is that we've had any other kind of idea, right? I mean, they look at the history of the settlement of the United and creation of the United States of America and see hundreds of years of their ideas holding sway, and then this civil rights movement in the 1960s that somewhat changed it. And all we have to do is go back to where we were in the 1950s, and everything will be fine again for them. And I think that the failure of our society to be upfront about that foundational element is a real part of the problem, because we can't really understand how our policies have a racist impact, even if it's not a racist making these policies, that if we don't understand that history and how these policies were created and why they were created, it's a lot harder to reduce them. So when you have a law enforcement agency that is struggling to identify possible national security threats, the white supremacists aren't a threat to the communities that they live in. They're not a threat to their families, so it's easier for them to say that's just a fringe element that's not really committing serious crimes. And what we have to focus on are the black identity extremists who are actually challenging the status quo that is maintaining the system that we have. And I think that, you know, whether you call that, you know, whether that's overt racism or implicit racism or structural racism, certainly race is at the center of those decisions. And this, you know, it's interesting at this period now where Congress at least has been focused on doing something about white nationalist violence, that the Justice Department is arguing they need more laws, as if, you know, when I worked these cases in the 1990s, nobody said we didn't have the laws to work them. Of course we did, and we do. But again, they're using the public fear as an opportunity to expand their powers once again, rather than showing any real interest in changing their policies that deprioritize the investigation of this violence.
Has the mission and funding of the FBI changed under the current president, or is it largely consistent with the previous administration?
I'm not aware of any change in the mission. I mean, obviously, the FBI has such broad discretion that I'm certain that there are internal discussions going on about what should be prioritized. Again, it's interesting with this, with the public conversation going on about white nationalist violence. The FBI has mission priorities. Counterterrorism is number one, and that includes domestic terrorism, which they consider white supremacy domestic terrorism, even though obviously there are white supremacists outside the United States, and we didn't invent Nazis. But when a white supremacist kills somebody, the FBI only rarely calls it domestic terrorism. They more often call it a hate crime. And if they call it a hate crime, it drops down to the 5th priority. And actually, most often, they call it gang crime. And when it's a gang crime, it drops down to the 6th priority. So just by the label that the FBI puts on that crime, it deprioritizes the investigation. Moreover, on top of that, the Justice Department has a policy that says that defers the investigation of hate crimes to state and local law enforcement, even though 6 states don't have hate crime laws and most states don't use them. So only 12%, 12.5% of police departments report hate crimes occurring within their jurisdictions, yet the Justice Department policy remains to defer to state and local investigations. So it creates this huge blind spot where we don't know how many of these crimes are being committed by organized white supremacist groups because nobody's investigating it. And those policies could be changed tomorrow. The Justice Department could make that change, but they're not making that change. They're instead pleading to Congress to broaden their domestic terrorism authorities, which I believe aren't going to be used against white supremacists any more than they are now. They're going to be used to continue targeting environmentalists, these so-called black identity extremists, other groups. In fact, the President of the United States came out and said that anti-fascism is the domestic terrorism threat today, when, again, there's not a single homicide in the United States related to anti-fascist activity. So you wonder where they're getting that idea, and it becomes just political, and it's just a matter of using that label to target their political opposition.
So I guess I'm going to rephrase this question slightly. Are you concerned that intel agencies have unfettered access to Americans' communications and speech, as the Snowden revelations showed us?
Very concerned, and especially concerned as a one-time whistleblower, right? I mean, I'm not part of the demographic that was normally targeted by the FBI. I was the golden boy of the FBI right up until I complained about FBI policies and practices. And then all of a sudden it was an effort to find some reason that they could hold me, paint me as the one that was operating outside the rules. And they went to a pretty severe extent to do that. So I know that that broad collection that's just holding this information actually poses a continuing threat. And you might not be targeted today, but whenever you run for office against somebody that the establishment wants in office, it's easy to go to this vast trove of information and pull out something that might not be illegal, but would be embarrassing if it leaked. I often think of the Eliot Spitzer case, where that was a Patriot Act authority that expanded bank secrecy reporting that it ended up being a so-called suspicious activity report about the use of $6,000. Now, that doesn't meet any kind of standard of reporting, but it looks suspicious to somebody, so they reported it. And that fact alone, that Governor Spitzer had used $6,000 of his own money, justified to the FBI opening up a political corruption case that involved incredibly dangerous activity, having a governor who has a protective detail being followed by an FBI detail, both of which are armed and designed to find the other, right? I mean, this is like an incredibly dangerous situation for very little justification. And in fact, when you go to the indictment, Eliot Spitzer was never charged with any crime. It charged the the Call Girl organization. And if you go through the indictment, each client is just numbered, and each one has a paragraph or two describing their activity until you get to client number 9. And then there was egregious detail that was clearly designed for no legal purpose, just to embarrass and effectively cause the governor to resign. So, in other situations, you could find just as easily that the way that kind of power over you, that informational disadvantage you have, gives them so much power to challenge somebody who's just complaining about the system, just a whistleblower or somebody who is running on an agenda that runs contrary to what the people who have access to that information want to happen.
Sort of amazing to think back to a political time where that could embarrass someone into resigning.
Yeah. Right.
Given the FBI's ability to repel every attempt to tame it, from the Church Commission to the Obama administration, although I'm not entirely sure the Obama administration tried very hard, would Americans be better off abolishing the FBI and starting from scratch?
And this was actually a topic of discussion if people are old enough to remember. It's one thing with the interns at the Brennan Center that I find out how old I am regularly. But if those my age who remember back to that time, that there was a discussion of creating a different agency, an MI5 style domestic intelligence agency. And I was against the idea then, and I remain against it. I think that there is a part of the FBI that can be very effective in keeping communities safe and holding the most powerful to account, as Theodore Roosevelt suggested. So I think there's something worth saving there. I think it's that we need it to be a very different agency that is above all transparent. I mean, one of the things that I found working the criminal justice side, that transparency often reduced skepticism. When I was undercover with anti-government militia group in Northwest Washington, there were 8 or 10 defendants, and there was a long trial, about 6 weeks. I was on the stand for 6 days, which is no fun, cross-examined by 8 or 10 defense attorneys. And with the militia groups, there was a lot of popular support. There were a lot of groups that came out to the trial every day and would voice support for these people that weren't part of the case. They weren't people who were under investigation. They just were sympathetic to the viewpoint that these people were promoting. So they were there for the entire 6 weeks, so it created this weird little family environment with law enforcement and these anti-government militia types. And at the end of the trial, even before the verdicts had come back, one of the gentlemen came up and asked to shake my hand. And I shook his hand, and he said, I just want to thank you for what you did here, because I sat through the trial, and I saw the evidence, and it's very clear to me these people were going to hurt somebody, and that would have been very bad for my movement. And so I thank you, Mr. Undercover Agent, for infiltrating like-minded people and doing this. And here's somebody who's active in anti-government militias, the most skeptical person of government, but the transparency of our criminal justice system allowed him to make his own determination that what the government had done in that case, at least, was fair and appropriate and necessary to protect the public, and to protect his ability to continue being involved in that kind of a movement where his rights were not being interrupted by our anti-criminal activities.
So you're pretty critical of the FBI. I mean, this book is a book-length criticism of the Bureau's failures, but you're also pretty adamant that an agency of a certain type is necessary. So envisioning a world in which the FBI is a law enforcement agency that protects Americans from violence, that prosecutes people who deserve and need to be prosecuted, and is working on holding the most powerful to account, and not simply the people who are easiest to make cases against. How do we even get there? What does that look like?
Well, I think it starts out with a new bipartisan comprehensive review of all of the post-9/11 authorities and programs and activities to find first what's effective. If a program like the metadata program that collected all of our calling data, the government later acknowledged that it was never helpful to stopping a single terrorist plot. So even though they collected all of our telephone calling data over more than a decade, that was never actually helpful to any mission that they had. So why keep that around? And if you think we shouldn't keep that around, reach out to your member of Congress, because we're actually going to have that debate this winter, where again the Patriot Act is up for a reauthorization. So part of it is making sure that these authorities that we're giving them are actually necessary to a legitimate goal, and then if this is something that can be used legitimately, how do we cabinet it properly and write strong guidelines to ensure that it's never being abused and can't be abused, and that if it is abused, that that's discoverable not just by the overseers in Congress and the courts, but by the general public, so we can have a common understanding of what this agency's authorities are and how it's supposed to operate.
So you describe a cycle in your book that I think is sort of you mentioned today, that is sort of repeating itself, which is every time there is a type of violence that becomes particularly focused on in the public eye right now, it's white supremacy because of all the shootings we've seen. Before it was 9/11 and radical jihadism. How do you avoid this cycle where there's some sort of catastrophe, and then the FBI says, well, if you want us to stop this, you're going to have to repeal these constitutional rights? How do you avoid that? Even say we follow the path that you described, how do you avoid that cycle of something terrible happens, Congress says, what do you need to stop this from happening again? And the FBI says, give us more power. Or can you stop that cycle, or is it just a question of having to clean house every few decades?
I think stopping that cycle is all of our responsibility, and part of what I talk about in the reform chapters is how different communities that have been targeted by inappropriate FBI surveillance or investigative activities have banded together to make sure that that we're protecting one another, and I think that's an essential element. And I think it's incumbent on the media to be better at making sure that it's accurate information that's going out. It's fascinating that we live in a very safe country. It's safer, and it's easy to make this argument for people who lived in New York in the 1980s and 90s. It's so much safer than it was just a few decades ago. And there are still problems, Chicago and Baltimore in particular, but we're much safer than we were 20, 30 years ago. There's much less terrorism of all kinds than there was in the 1970s. So number one, accepting that we're a very safe country and we have big problems that we need to solve, and worrying about these problems, if they're being handled appropriate by law enforcement, shouldn't be part of the public concern. But it's fascinating because even as the homicide rate has dropped significantly since the 1990s, what has fallen with it is the homicide solve rate. So even though there are far fewer homicides, we're solving less of them. And the last 2 years that were reported, 2016 and 2017, 40% of the homicides in the United States aren't solved, right? So even though we've expanded all these law enforcement powers, we've expanded the information sharing, actual violent crime impacting our communities is getting less attention than it was. And I believe that we can do far more to prevent terrorism by putting murderers and armed robbers in jail, because my cases were focused on people who are committing that criminal activity, who are exploiting those criminal networks to get what they needed to commit their terrorist acts. And part of it is making sure that we're holding all of the agencies more accountable. And there is an effort within state and local governments now to look at their participation in federal task forces. When I worked undercover in these terrorist cases, the Joint Terrorism Task Force had a rule that if state and locals came to help on the task force, they had to obey the FBI's rules. And that was because the FBI's rules were usually more strict than the state and local rules. Well, once those rules were watered down after 9/11, you were now having a situation where police departments working on the Joint Terrorism Task Force were being told that they should follow rules that were much looser than their own rules in their state and localities. So places like San Francisco and Portland finally said, we can't participate in these task forces because the rules are so lax. So there's an opportunity for, I think of it as the reverse of the civil rights movement, where you had the federal government stepping in where state and local governments weren't protecting citizen rights, where here you have state and local governments stepping up where the federal government is not protective enough of individual rights.
So I think that's a good place to end, but Mike is going to be signing books right over there, so you should come over and you should get a book and you should have Mike sign it. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you to the Brennan Center for hosting, and thank you, Mike, for talking about your book with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you, Adam, for doing this. And you've been writing so brilliantly on these topics for so long. But some of the recent stuff you've been writing. So if you don't follow Adam's journalism at The Atlantic, you should start. But I'd also like to thank Michael Waldman at the Brennan Center, and John Cowell, and the program directors, Faiza Patel and Liza Goitein, who gave me the opportunity and the time to write this book and put this kind of event together. So thanks to the Brennan Center and all the staff who worked so hard to make this possible. Thanks very much.